Kia ora koutou. My name is Mirjam Schindler. I'm a senior lecturer at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington in human geography. And what I'll be presenting about today is I'm really interested in understanding the distribution of some of the benefits that we know green spaces, trees, any sort of urban greenery provides to people, how that is distributed across different spaces within the city, but also across different population groups, as we know that there is some inequity going on in that space. All right. So we have heard about some of those benefits today, but some of those benefits, especially the health benefits that Malcolm has referred to, we only receive those basically if we're actually exposed to green spaces. And by green spaces, I'm referring widely to parks, any informal green spaces, trees, and so on. So some of those green spaces, some of the benefits we only receive if we're exposed, whether that's active exposure through actually using those green spaces, or whether it's through passive exposure by just having a green outlook from where we live. And we know that those distributions are inequitable. And that is partly due to the inequity in terms of how green spaces are distributed within urban areas in terms of quantity. We know that there is some of the population groups, for example, are disadvantaged in terms of having accessibility to green spaces, but also that some suburbs, for example, have a disadvantage in actually having green spaces there. But my argument is that the quantity of green spaces is one side of the story. But we've heard a lot about today that it's also about the quality of green spaces. We might not actually engage or be actively seeking exposure to green spaces if they're not of the quality that we're actually interested in, whether that's related to the facilities within that green space, or whether it's not biodiverse, it's not actually catering for the sort of use that we envision for green spaces. But the challenge here is that, as we've heard today, that what is a high-quality green space really varies by spatial location, by cultural context, by population groups, and so on. But the third component that I really want to focus on, that is receiving less attention here, is also that even if we have quantity of green spaces available, and we have high-quality green spaces for a particular local community, it doesn't necessarily still mean that people are seeking active exposure. And that's also because we need a sort of orientation towards nature, where we need to have a sort of relationship with nature in order to actually actively seek out using green spaces, going for a run, going for a walk, going into the bush in our free time, or even making time to actually do that. So my argument here, and this orientation towards nature is obviously shaped by education, by our awareness of health benefits, for example, of active exposure, but it's also influenced by our childhood experiences, and that connects to Margaret's talk, that if we don't have in our childhood experiences to connect with nature, we might not develop a strong connection, strong orientation to nature. So my main argument in the talk is basically that we need a needs-based approach, working with the local community to actually understand all those three components and address inequities in that sense, that we have a reflective approach working with the community to get those three things right. And I'll provide some evidence from three examples of my research. One of the examples is from Europe, but it's still applicable to the Aotearoa context as well, where we actually surveyed about 600 people in three cities, as you see here on the maps, about their use of green spaces. So we asked them where they live and where they usually go to use a green space. And you can see that those spatial patterns are highly complex. And even though some people have lots of green space in the neighborhood where they live, they would still decide to travel half across the city to use another green space that might have the quality that they actually prefer. So we've calculated the distances between their residential location and the preferred green space. And we found that those distances are actually related to social components as well. So for example, we know that those more educated would travel shorter distances, for example, to use those green spaces. So it's not just about the quantity and providing a certain threshold of green spaces within cities, but it's also about the quality and providing green spaces that actually does not need people require people to travel further to use those green spaces. Another example that I want to give is from Wellington, where we again surveyed about 700 people in the greater Wellington region, but this time we actually asked them specifically about their nature orientation. So we asked them, how important is it to you to live in the green neighborhood? And interestingly, it's very important for most, but there are still like 5% that were where it's not a strong orientation towards nature. But again, we found significant socio-spatial patterns in who values green spaces. And that's, for example, those living in the city center are less likely to put a strong preference towards green spaces. Those living in the periphery, in contrast, had a really strong valuation of green spaces. There was also socioeconomic patterns in who valued and who doesn't value green spaces as much. And also why people would actually put an emphasis on green spaces in their local neighborhoods varied by socio-spatial context. So for example, those living in the city center really explained that they valued green spaces as a contrast to city life, as a contrast to urban life. Whereas those living in Porua, for example, were more likely to put an emphasis on green spaces because of their interest in using them with their whānau and doing sports and community sports and so on. So there's a huge variety in why people and how people value green spaces based on socioeconomic background, but also spatial location within the city. We asked the same people how satisfied they're actually with the opportunity to engage with nature in their local neighborhoods. And interestingly, again, we saw strong socio-spatial patterns in who is actually satisfied. And that was not only because of the quantity available to them, but also because of the quality of green spaces, like biodiversity, facilities, and so on. Those living in the city center, again, were less likely to be actually satisfied with the opportunity to engage with nature. But for a planning perspective, we were really interested in putting those two pieces of information together and actually ask who are those that actually have a strong or some orientation towards green spaces, but don't have the opportunity at the moment to engage with nature. And that's an astonishing 10% in our sample population, which is quite unexpected, I find, for a green city as Wellington. And those are likely those of older age groups, those in the central city again, and those who do not have either private or public green spaces available in their local neighborhood. But interestingly, it's not solely driven by income or any other measure like that. Again, it's about the complex socio-spatial context and not just one of those components. The last example that I want to show is again from Wellington. It connects well to what Simon said in this morning, where we specifically looked at street trees, or trees in the distribution of trees within Wellington City based on data that Brent will be talking about later this afternoon, and data from the PCE, where we're interested in understanding why the distribution of street trees particularly is inequitable in Wellington. And that again came up that it was not only driven by deprivation, for example, but it has to do with, or we found a strong, significant correlation with the urban layout. So for example, in those areas where there's a regular grid pattern, for example, or where there's lots of setbacks and infill development, there is likely more potential still to plant street trees. And that's hugely interesting for the Wellington case study because property owners are actually allowed to plant the roadside reserves adjacent to their properties. So if we're targeting a street planting initiative, for example, we could look at those areas where there is huge potential, unmet potential of street planting sites, roadside reserves where there is potential. But keeping in mind, it's really about the urban layout as well, and we can incentivize street planting by actually designing our streets in a way that we can have those spaces available. Thank you, that's it from me.